Thank you. Unfortunately, my voice is a little bit gone because we went on this huge rally yelling for Ukraine the other day, so please do excuse me for that. Now, we all know that after the 24th of February, we live in a different world. A country could no longer be certain that it could live freely with its own territory and make its own choices, whether to join some blocs or some military defensive alliance or not. It's simply, we live in a world where a stronger country can invade a weaker country, which it thinks it's a weaker country. It might prove to be even stronger, and to try to ruin it, to conquer it, to annex part of its territory, to impose its own leadership on it, to tell her where to join European Union, NATO, or whatever. Now we live in this world. We have to wake up. The United Nations, in its charter, can no longer secure anyone. Now what is happening in Ukraine could happen in any country in the world nowadays. The only way to protect yourself is either to have a very, very strong army, or to join a defensive alliance, or a group of nations like the European Union. There is simply no other way in the new world we've been ushered in. And it's not very likely that it would change anytime soon. So what we definitely need is, of course, to help Ukraine by arms, by food, by anything it needs to defend itself, but also to make it very certain, with non-certain terms, that it has a right to be part of the European Union, to be given status which will allow it, in hopefully much calmer times, to become part of the European Union. And the same must be said in very, very certain terms about Georgia and about Moldova. Every European country that fulfills certain requirements has the right to be part of the European Union, and nobody else can put a veto on that process. So we have to be very, very firm on that. So whether we should give Ukraine status of candidate, of course. Even we should start negotiating with Ukraine to join the European Union right now, to make it sure to Russia that it has no right to put a veto on the geopolitical and civilizational choice of the Ukrainian people. Of course, as the esteemed colleague said, we should not picture Russia itself and the Russian culture as an enemy. And I'll give you now, the Russians, not only under Putin, but even under Yeltsin, were saying how bad it is that NATO is advancing towards Russia. But that absolutely makes no sense. And I'll give you an example. In Northern Europe, we all know that the Kingdom of Norway was part of Sweden until 1905. Now, Sweden is a member of the European Union, but is not a member of NATO. Norway, on the other hand, is a member of NATO, and it's not a member of the European Union. And yet, they have wonderful relations among them. You cross the line, the border, without checking. They are cooperating in any way possible. So if Russia wants to be a modern state, that would not be impeded in any way if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO or member of the European Union. The only reason why Russia is against those countries to join the European Union, is to join NATO, is because they do not regard them as real countries. As Putin said, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a greatest catastrophe. I mean, what about the British Empire? I'll ask my esteemed colleague, do Brits today regard losing of India as the greatest catastrophe? I mean, it's ridiculous. We're living in modern era, and all nations have the right to choose their path, and of course, not to create problems for the others. Ukraine has never created problems for Russia. It never planned to attack Russia. Russia is attacking Ukraine. So we have to be very, very firm and stated in law and to give Ukraine and the other countries, as I said, let's not forget them, who applied for EU membership, Georgia and Moldova, clear answers that they will be, as long as they want to, of course, members of the European Union. Now, when we talk about North Macedonia, our party is taking a view that is slightly different from the official Bulgarian position. And I'll try to explain what we mean. Now, Bulgaria and North Macedonia do not need a compromise. What we need is a catharsis. Catharsis, however, it's necessary to be in both countries, not only in one. Because Bulgarian historiography is more accurate than the Macedonian historiography when we talk about things that happened more than a century ago. And it complies with the world historiography's view about this period. However, I'm afraid to say that the Bulgarian historiography is completely at loss of understanding the processes that took place in North Macedonia in the last century. We do not understand them well at all. Now, if we have a time machine and somehow go back to Skopje, say 100 years ago, and ask confidently most people on the street, do you feel Bulgarian? Do you feel part of the Bulgarian ethnicity or nation? More people would say yes, and very few would say no. But how do we know that? I know that because my grandma was a refugee from Skopje. She was a Bulgarian from Skopje. And more than 1 million people in Bulgaria today can trace their descendants back to Macedonia from 2-3 generations ago. And we have kept their books, we have kept their letters, we know what they thought. But we are at loss to understand how did it happen that though today, if you go in Macedonia, in Skopje, most people would say that they never been Bulgarians, that they are completely different. How did it happen? And this is something that we have to ask ourselves as well, not only to ask them. Was there a violence of which the esteemed colleague Alexander Yurdanov spoke? Of course there was. There was a horrible violence, and I would say that the most horrific violence on ethnic grounds, not ideological, which was after the Second World War, but on ethnic grounds, took place earlier, took place under the Kingdom of Serbian, Croats, and Slovenians, where Bulgarians were really hardly persecuted just for being Bulgarians. And that's why so many of them left and crossed the border. Now, later on, there was even what I called in my book the Macedonian Civil War. There was a conflict even within Macedonia between those people who believed that retaining their Bulgarian identity is something of a value. But they, for no fault of their own, at that time had no other allies possible than the Italian fascists and later on the Nazis. It was not their fault that the great democracies in Europe at that time, in the name of England and France, for their eternal shame, were supporting the bloody regime of Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And of course, there was a new generation that grew up in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, that at home spoke on the local dialects, which their ancestors have always considered as Bulgarian. But they were schooled in Serbian from the first grade on, up to the university, which usually the university schooling was not done in Macedonia. There was no universities there. They had to go to Belgrade or Zagreb, and they were taught entirely in Serbo-Croatian. So in this generation, the idea that the only solution, the only way out of being repressed and being assimilated by the Serbian Rus were indeed not to identify with their geopolitical rival Bulgaria, but try to work hard to establish their own national identity. And there was a clash between those who believe Bulgaria to be that they have to retain the Bulgarianness and those who didn't. And later on, I would not get deeper into history. Of course, after the Second World War, there was a long period of time when, yes, Tito's regime was cruel, it was criminal. At first, it was even worse than in Bulgaria, but later, when Bulgaria degenerated behind the Iron Curtain, Tito's regime, with the help of the West, achieved much better standards. So it's the development of creating of this nationality was a very complicated one. But in the end, it proved to be the only way the descendants of the Bulgarians in Macedonia to get independence. Because the earlier times, whether by uprisings, which were definitely by Bulgarian characters, it's enough to read what's written in the language in which the flags they were hoisting were written. Then in the wars, when we all fought together, our ancestors fought together in the wars, but it all ended up in defeat. So the only way to have those people to have sovereignty and not to live under other sovereignty was to create a nation of their own. But this nation, in these circumstances, have to prove that it had nothing to do with Bulgaria. And it's very complicated. So it's very difficult to reach a situation in which today's Macedonians will be so certain in their identity that they would have no problems to say, yes, a very big part of our cultural heritage is Bulgarian by character in terms of what was understood a century ago. And it would be very hard for modern day Bulgarians to understand and to say, yes, Macedonians, they have their nations, they have their language, but we share this historical legacy. It's not only our own, it's shared. Now, this is very hard to achieve, and probably the European Union, and there are people in Bulgaria who are trying to break the deadlock. And indeed, in North Macedonia, there were very brave intellectuals and politicians. I would mention, for instance, two of them. The first foreign minister of independent Macedonia, Mr. Denko Maleski, and a minister of culture and later of education, Dimitar Dimitrov, who was a father of the current Minister of European Affairs. They both, in their books, bravely admitted the Bulgarian roots of most, not all, but most of today's Macedonians. They were completely vilified in their own country. They were declared traitors, etc. But what is worse, that Bulgarian elite, Bulgarian scientists, Bulgarian politicians failed to find common language even with them. And I'll end up with the new idea when Bulgarians want to ask that Bulgarians in Macedonia are written in the constitution. Now, I think this would be a very big mistake, because this means that there is absolute clear-cut distinction. You're either Macedonian or Bulgarian. But for a long time, for several generations, it was completely normal for a person, if asked to be both, to be Macedonian and Bulgarian, to think that they have some their own particularities, but to belong to the overall Bulgarian matrix. That was the thought for few generations. And we need to find catharsis, and the European Union, and especially your party, our party, will have to work, EEP will have to work to find this catharsis, not a compromise, a catharsis. Thank you.